As game masters, we're living in a golden age. We have an incredible wealth of resources at our fingertips, available for building, improving, and enhancing our campaigns in countless ways. Among these are published scenarios. Never before have GMs had such easy access to so many adventures. This is particularly true for running D&D. Wizards of the Coast alone produces enough adventures every year to fuel at least 3 full campaigns, and that's not even counting all the third-party publishers, Patreon-funded adventure initiatives, DM's Guild creators, adventures converted from previous editions, and just fans posting cool stuff on their websites. Now, broadly speaking, these adventures take 2 forms. There are an increasing number of full campaigns, ready to run, straight out of the box, published each year. But most of this adventure content is still episodic. Short scenarios designed to be played in 1, 2, or maybe a few sessions. These scenarios can be played as one-shots, but most of us are interested in more than that. And to run a full campaign of episodic adventures, you'll need to pick a bunch of them and run them one after another. Of course, these adventures weren't written to be played together. Each adventure will be a single episode, a complete fun experience in itself, but you won't see the events of one adventure spill over into another, and things won't build over the course of the campaign to a dramatic, unified conclusion. And that can be great. A life itself is often just a series of things that happen. A collection of short stories can be just as much fun as a novel, and there are things a collection of short stories can do that a novel can't. But if you want your short scenarios to capture the imagination, like the tales of Conan, or Elric, or Farfred and the Grey Mouser, then you'll want to do a little bit more. You'll want to stitch those adventures together. Let's say that you have 2 adventures that you want to run for your group. How can you stitch those together into a unified experience? Start by recasting the characters in one adventure with characters from the other adventure. You can do this with any character, but it's often particularly easy to focus on patrons and villains. For example, if the PCs are asked by a friendly druid to journey into the nearby swamps and find the mystic heart that's corrupting the wildlife in one adventure, and then hired in the other adventure by a baron to hunt a legendary white stag, it can be quite easy to swap out the baron and instead have the druid send them after the stag, or vice versa. It can be easier to recast characters like this if they are quite similar to each other, but they don't have to be. For example, if the villain of Adventure X is the Dread Lich Vitharic, and the villain of Adventure Y is the Ancient Lich Tam Shun, well, it doesn't take a lot of imagination or effort to make those both the same Lich, so that the PCs can build a relationship with the antagonist over multiple confrontations and multiple adventures. But you can do the same thing even with very different characters. For example, a red dragon named Basaridus who seeks vengeance against the Baron, or the Druid, whichever, who stole his treasure can just as easily be the Lich Vitharic who seeks the phylactery that was stolen from her. When you recast a character like this, you don't need to completely overwrite one character with the other. In fact, you probably shouldn't. Instead, you can take elements from both characters and use them together. The result will be a richer and more interesting character. For example, the Baron, who was supposed to send the PCs to hunt the White Stag, was written to have a magical talking sword which contains the soul of his dead son. When you recast the Baron, you can give the Druid that same sword and the same dead son. What does that do to the Druid's character? Now obviously this technique doesn't have to be limited to characters either. You can do the same thing with other elements of an adventure too. Take locations, for example. At a broad level, Adventure 1 might take place in the village of Olmsted, and Adventure 2 might take place in the village of Torkney. You don't actually need to move the PCs from one village to another in order to run both of those adventures. You can just change the name of Torkney to Olmsted, and away you go. In the process, of course, you can also scoop up all the NPCs who live in Torkney and add them to Olmsted. Are there interesting businesses or cool landmarks in Torkney? Oh, great. I guess those are all in Olmsted now, too. Do this with a bunch of adventures, and suddenly, instead of having a half-dozen generic fantasy villages scattered around your campaign, you have one village that's teeming with cool details and a huge cast of interesting characters that your players have built relationships with. Along the way, you're likely to run into some duplication. For example, maybe Olmsted and Torkney both have blacksmiths. When that happens, you might choose to recast, taking the best bits of both to create a Gestalt blacksmith that uses the smithy blueprints from Olmsted and the husband and daughter of the blacksmith in Torkney. But you might also use both elements separately, so that your village of Olmsted now has rival blacksmiths. What form does that rivalry take? Are there any cool situations or even entire adventures that might be spun out of that rivalry? Of course, you aren't limited to just merging whole communities like this. You can also recast specific locations. For example, Vithoric murders everyone in a church in Adventure X. Could that instead be worshippers in the Druid's Grove from the swamp adventure you ran earlier? Of course it could. And now the players have a personal relationship with the site and with the Lich's victims. This technique isn't just about repeating elements over and over again for the sake of repetition. It's about reincorporating these elements in new and different ways. As you fold these elements into your campaign again and again and again, the players will develop deeper and more meaningful relationships with them as the elements themselves gain depth and meaning. The other thing to note here is that you don't need to plan ahead in order to perform a campaign stitch like this. You can run your first adventure, for example, with no idea what's coming next. When you pick a second adventure, you can just think about recasting stuff in the second adventure with elements taken from the first adventure that you ran. But if you do plan ahead, if you know some of the adventures you're planning to run later in the campaign, then obviously the stitch can work in both directions, with elements from Adventure B being recast into Adventure A. And another technique you can use if you're planning ahead is linking adventures with clues. Using the 3-clue rule, for example, you can plant clues in the Corrupted Swamp and the White Stag adventures, hinting at the existence of a villain named Vithoric. When she shows up later, the players will have a great, "Aha! There she is!" We've also been talking in terms of sequential adventures. You run Adventure A and then you run Adventure B, but that's not strictly necessary either. A great technique for stitching multiple adventures together is to just run them at the same time. The actions of the players will often stitch them together for you. They'll take an ally from Adventure A and ask them to help with Adventure B, and then presto, the bad guy from Adventure B is targeting characters from Adventure A for payback, and it's all one big happy campaign. In my experience, this works best with medium-sized adventures that play out over several parts. You can run the first part of Adventure A, and then the first part of Adventure B, and then the second part of Adventure A, and so forth. Now, so far we've also been talking about stitching elements from one adventure into another adventure. But a campaign is made up of more than just adventures, and you can stitch those components together too. For example, look at the backgrounds your players have created for their characters. Can those elements be recast into the adventures you've chosen to run? Well, probably. For example, one of your players may have created a character who's driven to solve the mysterious murder of their sister. You can easily make Vithoric the murderer, for example. Or the druid, if you want to get twisty with it. You can use a similar technique to stitch PCs to each other during character creation. If two of your players have created characters with wise mentor figures in their background, for example, you might suggest that they could both have the same wise mentor figure. And maybe that's the druid who's secretly responsible for killing the third PC's sister. There's also the campaign setting itself. With a kitchen sink setting, you can just take stuff from the adventures you choose to run and keep dumping it into the setting. But it can also be effective to reincorporate the established lore of your setting by recasting adventure elements. For example, your campaign may already have several orders of knighthood. When an adventure calls for a knight, which of these existing orders could they belong to? When a different adventure is set in the ruins of a chancery, could it have once belonged to the same order? Each time you do this, you're choosing to add depth to your campaign world instead of shallow breadth, and each element feeds back into the other elements, adding exponential complexity over time. For example, discovering the ruined chancery can reveal a tragic truth about the NPC knight's backstory, enhancing their character, and potentially the PC's relationship with that character, in ways that wouldn't be possible if the chancery was just another bit of random lore tossed into the sink. Finally, what if you are in fact running a full campaign? Whether it's something you've designed yourself or a published campaign like Dragon Heist or Descent into Avernus or the Masks of Nyarlathotep, you can still use these same techniques to add new adventures to the campaign. to integrate the player characters into the lore of the campaign, or to adapt the campaign to your own campaign setting. Along the way, you'll discover it takes surprisingly little effort to stitch a campaign together. In large part, this is because the players will help you without ever realizing that they're doing it. They want the campaign to make sense. They want it to be a coherent experience, and for their actions this week to have an impact on what happens to them next week. They'll also see connections you never imagined, and take actions to create those connections even where they didn't exist. Like any good seamstress, your stitches will be invisible, and it will seem to your players as if the whole campaign was one glorious creation. Now, if you wouldn't mind, take a moment to stitch yourself to the Alexandrian by liking, commenting, and subscribing down below. Good gaming. This is Justin Alexander, and I hope to see you at the table.